Hello, I'm Eclipse, and lately I've been watching a lot of craft cosplay costume making videos, and today I'm going to attempt to make one without any experience. The thing I wanted to try is a series of seasonal witches inspired by this video made by Prickly Alpaca. In an attempt to make this project at least a little bit consistent, I tied each witch to one memory or image of their season, gave them a familiar magical ability, stuck to a range of seasonal plants/items, and added a mask. Everything else was just me making it up as I went. For winter, I was inspired by the huge amounts of snow I normally get where I live in Canada, and the image of walking through a pine forest at night and seeing all the plants. With that in mind, I chose pine trees, pine cones, mistletoe, holly, and nightshade to be the plants. I live in an area that sees lots of deer in the winter, so I decided to make that the familiar. I also chose to name the deer Belladonna, after the scientific name for daily nightshade. I thought picking incantations/spells was a perfect idea because of all the carols you hear. In terms of a design, I didn't know much besides wanting a floor-sweeping cloak and to use a red dress I have from an old witch costume. After raiding my favorite stash and looking at my other old costumes, I began to create a more detailed design. One trip to the store later, and I had everything I needed. The first thing I did was stitch rip this gigantic blanket with scissors because I could not find my stitch ripper. This was a bad idea because it took me about 5 hours to do. Silver lining is that I found this fuzzy layer in the middle and can add it in the cloak to make it extra warm. After that, I laid the fabric on the floor of my bedroom and attempted to use an old cloak as a guide because I hate patterns. You can see me really trying to make it work before I give up and go look for the pattern. Luckily for me, this pattern is really simple. I think it has 4 pieces in it. I was panicking a bit because I was unsure if the blanket was big enough, but I managed to make it work. So I pinned down all the patterns and cut them out. You can see me cutting it out with a piece of cardboard underneath the scissors because my floor is carpet and thus impossible to cut anything on. The kitties are very interested in this and were there from the cozy department to do quality control. When I was doing the last 2 panels for the cloak, I had incorrectly put them on the patterns, and one piece came out too short on one side. Thankfully, while I panicked, my sibling was nice enough to explain how to fix it by cutting out an extra small strip that could be sewed on. You can see my passionate dislike of patterns as I have switched to using the cutout pieces as a guide to cut the lining and fuzzy inside. With all the cloak pieces cut out, I pinned and sewed the 2 center panels of the outside together, then did the same with the side pieces, adding the extra strip to the side piece I cut short earlier, doing the same thing with the brown lining and fuzzy layer. I Frankensteined the hood with the real pattern and my raincoat hood. I didn't have enough of the cloak lining to use for the hood, so I used a cape from the dollar store instead. Next was pinning and sewing all the hood layers together. To sew the lining and the cloak together, I pinned it right sides together, sewed around the edges, leaving the top where the hood would be open, then turning the whole thing inside out. I attached the hood with 2 mini pins, then hand sewed it on. I tried the cloak on for the first time. I was really pleased with myself. It turned out perfect with the floor sweeping length and the fact it wrapped around my entire body. Using a snowflake brooch, I attached the cloak sides together and did the mandatory spin test. Now that the cloak was done, it was time to move on to the witch hat. Using a witch hat I had as a guide, I used newspaper to guesstimate a pattern for the witch hat, and of course, taking a quick break to pet another kitty before going back to work. I wanted the wreath to be the hat edge, so I used that as a guide. Next was cutting out the patterned pieces from the dollar store cloak, as well as cutting the hat brim pieces from cardboard to create support for the wreath. Once the pieces were cut out, I glued the cone pieces to look like they had been sewn, and with the help of my sibling, I glued one on the inside of the newspaper pattern. For the brim of the hat, I just glued the fabric around the cardboard pieces, then glued them together and the cone on top. To decorate the whole costume, I took a quick trip to the dollar store to grab a few things. Bells, bag of pine cones and whatever these red things are. Surprisingly difficult to find non-scented ones at the dollar store. They were definitely interesting. The label said cinnamon, but it did not smell like that. They're kept here because it is shedding like crazy. Wreath, pom-pom garland. They're a random thing I had lying around. From Halloween. Don't think it's called anything. It's just a vine of flowers with eyeballs. Some ribbon I found somewhere in my craft stash. Another wreath from the Dollar Tree. At the time of editing, I had discovered that apparently I cut and pinned some of the fur on the cloak off camera. Next, I pulled all the plants off of a stick wreath while one of my cats tried to eat every piece. It was very difficult to deal with, and she managed to run away with a few things. One of the rare times I had forethought and decided to dye a test strip of the fur before moving onto the real thing. My idea was to use some acrylic paint and water to act as a dye since it has worked for me with past projects. It's not completely dry yet, but it's close enough that I now have a good idea this will work. Maybe I'll use hot water and that will make it even darker. In a large bucket went the fabric strips to soak so the dye could be even, and then I added the paint to the water and swished around the strips until it was all coated, and then hung them up in my shower to dry. So it didn't really work the way I wanted to. Besides making a ginormous mess, the fur didn't really dye, just the tips of it, and even when I brushed it out with a hairbrush, it still looked really bad. It was uneven and lots of spots were dark, as you can see in the photo. After purchasing some real fabric dye, I re-soaked the fabric and then loosely followed the instructions on the bottle. God, if I can get this color on them, that'd be great. I have to let this sit for at least 30 minutes. And I know it's gonna be darker when it's wet before I wash it out. Oh God. 40 minutes later about, and I don't think it got any darker, but I guess that's good. This is perfect. Oh God, this steam is messing up my camera lens. Once the fur was dry, it was really curly, so I took a hairbrush and just combed it out quickly before attaching all of the fur to the bottom of the cloak. I don't know how, but the fur shrunk, so I had to cut up some of the pieces and stick pine cones in between the strips to try and hide the fact that there wasn't enough to go around the bottom. My sibling was nice enough to try the cloak on so I could make sure that everything sit perfectly and looked amazing. They were so nice. This took about an hour. After I had everything in place, I just hand sewed all of the fur on and the pine cones in place. So I got stuck on how to figure out the bookbinding. I took a break and then I tried to search online for something, trying to figure out how it's done, but it looks complicated and I couldn't figure it out. But I saw this technique that you just use rubber bands to bind, so it seems promising. What works is you take your signature, your group of papers that you've already folded, and you just open it up and put the elastic through the middle of it. And I used a piece of cardboard to act as a spine. You just do this over and over again until you have attached all of your signatures to the spine. After gluing the spine into the cover, I trimmed the edges to better match the size of the pages. I then traced the cover onto what I think is some vinyl and cut it out, glued it to the cover. Moving on to what was probably my favorite part of this whole project, the mask. This might also be the only part of the project where I knew what I was doing. I started making the mask by wrapping a strip of cardboard around my face, using masking tape to attach smaller strips across the frame, angling the strips more sideways at the top and bottom of the mask, then turning it 90 degrees to do the same thing, trying to make all the strips the same height. For the snout of the mask, I started by making the bridge of the snout, with the next piece going off the opposite way before finally taping a few small pieces in between these gaps. I layered on lots of newspaper using watered down Elmer's glue to build the mask itself. Alright, honestly this looks kind of more like a jackal or a dog than a deer because of the snout being really short. But it only took like 2 hours, not bad. I'm not sure what to do about the inside. I might cut this part out and line the inside with something. I'm not sure yet. Some kind of fabric. But I know for the outside I'm gonna cover it with I'm going to cover the mask with this, just some random fabric from my stash, and maybe also use this a bit around the eyes or like the snout. I know it's really long, but I might leave it, or more likely I'll just cut the fabric shorter. And I had, where did it go? I used more of the black fabric that I made. Oh, here it is. I used more of this black fabric that I lined the hood of the cloak with and made the hat out of. I begun by trying to use templates to draw the eyes out before abandoning them to free sketch on the mask, cutting out the details from the dollar store cloak, followed by sawing circles in the mask for eye holes. Then using hot glue to attach the dollar store cloak on the inside and the brown fur on the outside. Gluing in the cloak strings for straps before adding the cloak details on the fur. For the wand, I'm thinking two different options. Either I use this stick that I found, or I use this wand that I made. This wand that I made for a witch costume in the past. I'm unsure. I like this option because of the red wood. It was made to go with the red dress that I'm going to wear. But I also kind of like this because it's like an actual stick. I'll probably decorate both, maybe go with both, maybe I decorate one and I like it better, but I think I'll start with this one and see where I go with it, where it takes me. Making, or should I say decorating the wand, was also a favorite part of this project for me. I was really inspired by these wands, despite not looking like them in the end, and copied the general vibe of them, hot gluing some of the berries to leafy bits. I ended up loving it so much I added them to my book cover. The ones I added to the wand were glued to a twine that I wrapped around the stick for a handle, adding in a few bells. Thing I did was hot glue the pine cones to the hat to match the cloak, then followed the theme from the wand and book and glued the berries and leafy bits in spots together. Next time, I think I would lean more into the weather aspect of the season and the colors of it. Like I said earlier, I don't have any or much knowledge in most of the things that I did, but I really enjoyed the project and I'm very happy with the results. Can't wait to do another project like this. Let me know if you have any tips, ideas, or comments below. See ya!